Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session for Amazon Linux. Before we get started, I wanted to take this moment and recognize that it's been 15 years since we launched the first version of Amazon Linux. So AL1, or Amazon Linux Army, was launched in 2010. 15 years has been a long time. We've learned a lot from our customers during this period, as well as we've adapted to the changes that have been happening upstream. I assume that many of you in the audience may have used all the 3 versions of Amazon Linux, or at least 2. So today, we are excited to present to you the latest features and AWS optimizations for Amazon Linux. I'm Shri, Product Manager for Amazon Linux, and with me, I have Frederick, who is the Principal Engineer for Amazon Linux. So let's dive right in. In our agenda today, we'll start with the Amazon Linux journey. We'll talk about the evolution of the various versions of Amazon Linux. Then we will talk about the key features and the innovations that has happened on AL 2023 in this year. We will then touch upon the most important timelines, upcoming timelines for end of support for Amazon Linux 2. And then we will talk about what's next for Amazon Linux, what's coming up. Finally, wrap it up. So that's the agenda for today's session. So let's start with what is Amazon Linux. Amazon Linux is a Linux distribution that was created by AWS and is maintained by AWS. It is a general purpose operating system, and it is optimized for AWS infrastructure. It also features container-ready architecture by integrating with AWS services like EKS and ECS. As you can imagine, all of Amazon uses Amazon Linux, and majority of our customers have a huge footprint on Amazon Linux. Amazon Linux is also the most popular operating system on AWS. Now, let us understand why our customers and Amazon uses Amazon Linux. First, it is optimized for AWS. Amazon Linux comes with specific configurations, for example, Cloud Init configurations, or comes with pre-installed set of AWS tools. So when you run your workloads on AWS, it is efficient. Second, we are highly secure. Security is a top of mind for everybody. In fact, security is a fundamental element to an operating system. If you have used Amazon Linux in the past, you probably know that Amazon Linux provides security patches and bug fixes on a regular basis. We'll talk a lot more about security in the upcoming slides as well. Third, we simplify operations. By having deep integrations with various AWS services, we can do so. So let's take an example of launching an instance. So when you launch an instance, you would have to consider various parameters. For example, network configuration, or attaching IAM roles, or EBS volumes, or even monitoring and logging. Amazon Linux has native integrations with all these AWS services so that when you launch an instance using Amazon Linux, it just works out of the box. Fourth is we are compliance ready. A lot of our customers in regulated industries like healthcare or finance or even government agencies, for them, compliance is not a nice to have. It is a must have. Amazon Linux is compliance ready. You will hear a little bit more about FIPS and DISA STIG in the upcoming slides. Last but not the least, Amazon Linux helps you lower your total cost of ownership. While you still have to pay for the compute resources, Amazon Linux has no licensing fee. And not just that, it comes with pre-built AWS support. This is one of the reasons that our customers really appreciate Amazon Linux, and all the reasons why they use Amazon Linux. Next, let us talk a little bit about the evolution. As I was talking about 2025 being the 15th year for Amazon Linux, AL1 was launched in 2010. It was purpose-built for the cloud and had integrations with AWS services. We then launched AL2 in 2017, which provided enhanced stability and security with a long-term support. AL2 became the most used OS because of this reason. In 2023, we launched AL 2023. This is our latest version of Amazon Linux. It provides modern features and improved security defaults. So now, we'll hear more about the innovations that we have done on AL 2023 from Frederick. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, sir. So 15 years of making Amazon Linux. I hadn't realized it had been so long. I just became aware of it as we were preparing those slides a few weeks ago. And it just sounds crazy to me. It got me thinking, like, what else, like, what have we not said about Amazon Linux in like previous sessions? This is the third year in a row that we present here about Amazon Linux 2023. And in fact, like, my teenager will tell you that 15 years old is pretty mature. There isn't much else that you can learn once you have reached that ripe age. But just like my teenager, Amazon Linux is picking up new tricks like every year. And so today in this session, I'm going to tell you about some of the new tricks that Amazon Linux has picked up in the past year. And we are going to go over kind of three of the key pillars of Amazon Linux development philosophy. So we are going to cover security, and see like new development that we have made in regard to Amazon Linux, like new news in the past year about security, because this is one of the things that our customers care the most about. We are going to see some new features that we have introduced, taking great care to maintain backward compatibility, because stability is the kind of the second element that we care a lot about when developing Amazon Linux. And then we are going to cover some like new features that we have introduced in the last year as well, in direct response to specific feedback from some of you, because making Amazon Linux like useful to you and like the rest of our customers is the third thing that the team is like focusing a lot on as we think through Amazon Linux development over the years. So let's start with security. And let's start with, like, more specifically with CVEs. If you are not familiar with what, I'm going to assume that most of you are already pretty familiar, at least partly familiar with what CVEs are. If you are not, like, you just need to know that CVE stands for Common Vulnerability and Exposures. And if you really don't know, like, every time that you hear me say CVE in the next like minute or so, just replace it in your head with security issue, and everything will still make sense. I'm sorry. So some of the most common questions that we get from customers about Amazon Linux have to do with how specific CVEs like affect or don't affect Amazon Linux versions. And this is kind of, those questions are easy to understand when you know that in every given year, the public CVE databases grow by tens of thousands of new entries. Most of those don't even relate to Linux at all. And so it's kind of easy to understand why like, it's become unrealistic to expect that every organizations and every system operators are able to keep up with this large flow of data that comes in all throughout the year. And this is where we come in, right? So our team at Amazon Linux on a daily basis evaluates a wide range of new CVEs that affect open source software that commonly makes up Linux distributions. And we do this with two main goals in mind, right? First, we want to make sure, and kind of obviously, right? We want to make sure that we can produce fixes, right, in a timely fashion for our customers to deploy. And we want to remain aware of the kind of the threat environments out there for the Linux ecosystem. But the second aspect of our evaluation has to do with making sure that we keep control over kind of the false positives, right? We understand that security updates, while they are like required and we all love them, right? They sometimes come with some level of operational risks. And so we want to make sure that we don't produce fixes or we don't bring new codes into Amazon Linux that is not required for security purposes. So a big thing that we try to do is making sure that we properly assess that the security issues that we discover, right, actually affect the version that we build in the operating system, and that the severity that have been determined by the reporters, right, makes sense and is accurate in the context of like Amazon Linux as it is used by our customers. So the outcome of this processes, and so far this year, has been about 1,500 security fixes that we have put out for Amazon Linux 2023 alone. That is without counting fixes that we've done for previous versions of Amazon Linux that are still supported at this time, or were still supported earlier this year. If we look a little bit at the repartition, like all the severity spread out and all the packages spread out across this data, so we see like over 500, and it's like over 500 important severity CVEs, over 800 medium severity CVEs. This year, the few critical. This is not every year. I think last year we had 0 or close to 0. And we also make an effort to try to fix like as many CVs as we can while prioritizing them based on severity. So we still get to fix like mediums and low severity CVs. What makes this data particularly interesting to me this year is that when we dove and look at actually which packages were the most affected by security issues, like in the past few years, we'll see, especially this year in particular, more than half of the important severity CVs and more than half of the medium severity CVs, in fact closer to 60%, are specifically about the Linux kernel and not the user space packages. And so if we look at the Linux ecosystem, and this will be true for most Linux distributions like today, we'll see that most of the threats that come in and most of the security patches that customers have to apply are being brought in by the kernel itself, which is kind of a little bit hard to avoid for all of us. So this gets us into like changes that we are making to how we maintain the Linux kernel for Amazon Linux. So I'm going to have to go first into like what's been happening in the upstream community about maintenance of the Linux kernel if we look at like over the past 12 or 18 months or so. And so the long-term support branches of the upstream kernel, the kernel from Linux.org, have changed their maintenance structure. And so as they were previously maintained for like up to 6 years, right, the upstream community has now switched, I think like a few months ago or last year, have now switched to maintaining them for strictly 2 years. And that has a big impact on the downstream customers. It has impact on the distro vendor, but it has impact on you as well as users of the Linux kernel. Because that means that considering the large volume of CVEs that get reported every year for the Linux kernel, it means that as our kernel ages, right, there's an increasing volume of security patches that need to be backported to the aging kernels. And all of those patches come with some level of risk. And we've seen kind of increased regressions as kernels get older and patches get backported by the upstream community. In fact, this is part of the reasons why those changes are happening in the Linux project. So what are we doing about this for Amazon Linux? So if you are running the like AL 2023 with the 6.1 kernel as we released AL 23 2 years ago, it doesn't change anything, right? We are going to keep maintaining the 6.1 kernel until the end of support date for Amazon Linux 2023. So as long as we support AL 2023, we are going to keep maintaining the 6.1 kernel. And you will be able to keep launching those armies tagged with the 6.1 kernel for that period of time as well. If you are adopting or you are moving on to newer kernels that we release, that's where you need to pay attention here. So earlier this year, we released the 6.12 kernel. That's our newest LTS branch for Amazon Linux. And starting with the 6.12 kernel, we are going to be maintaining future kernels of Amazon Linux for a period of 4 years, as opposed to maintaining them for the full duration, full support period of the operating system. So 4 years is still 2 years more than what we get from the upstream community. So we are doing this to make sure that those of you who require a specific kernel can keep running them with some level of stability. We also want to give time for compliance tools to catch up and scanners to catch up. We want to think about the delays for FIP certifications and so on. So 4 years felt like a pretty good balance. And from the feedback we've gotten with customers, this seemed to be hitting the right point. And if you are running the math in your head, as I'm talking, you probably already realize that as we move forward and as we release future versions of Amazon Linux, 4-year lifetime for the Linux kernel isn't going to give you a stable kernel for the full lifetime of future versions of Amazon Linux. And so in fact, you should expect that as you adopt future versions of Amazon Linux past TL 2023, that you will have to plan for at least one kernel upgrade along this path. We are hoping that by doing this, we're going to make migrations and updates simpler. And Sri will tell you some specific plans that we have moving forward in order to help this transition from one OS to the next and maintain stability with the Linux kernel. Pardon me. So in parallel to this, we have introduced new SSM parameters to target the Linux kernel for Amazon Linux 2023. And so if you're not familiar with SSM parameters, this is all we recommend that customers pick which Amazon Linux armies that they are going to launch. So customers always want to launch the latest version of the army that have been released. Customers want to launch an army that has already been patched and has no pending security issues. And so by using the SSM parameters in your auto-scaling groups configuration, then you can make sure that you always have the latest army that we have published. And so when we launched TL23, we tagged the Linux version. We encoded the kernel version in those SSM parameters. So as you launch the Amazon Linux 2023 armies, you are actually launching Amazon Linux 2023 with the 6.1 kernel. And so when we released the 6.12 kernel earlier this year, we did the same thing. So we created new SSM parameters with Amazon Linux 2023 encoded with the 6.12 kernel so that you can select which kernel you want your instances to launch with. What is new this year is that we also introduced new SSM parameters with a default kernel tag. And we are doing this because by talking to customers, we realize that most customers don't care or don't need to care about which kernel they are actually running. All they want is a working kernel on their Amazon Linux instance. So for those customers that don't have very specific requirements and that don't pay close attention to the performance profile on their instances, we recommend that they move to the kernel default SSM parameter. And so in those cases, if you were to launch this army this week, you will get the 6.1 kernel. A few weeks or a few months from now, you will transparently get migrated to the 6.12 kernel. And in the future, as we release new LTS kernel for Amazon Linux, you are going to get those new kernel versions as well. So we are hoping that this is going to make it easier to keep up with new kernels. And by migrating to new kernels, we believe that you are reducing your exposures to potential regressions that come from backporting patches to kernel as they become older. Of course, if you are taking this route, we expect that you will keep using Amazon Linux predictable updates to make sure that you are able to properly test between kernel versions, between different weeks of our releases, and that you are able to roll back or lock on the previous version while we stabilize bugs or issues that you will have reported. Another key topic that comes up in conversation with customers is compliance. As we hinted to a few moments ago, we know that many of our customers run an environment where there are strict compliance requirements that have to be met. And some of those requirements, some of those frequent requirements, are FIPS, as well as other related requirements of like the US federal government. So a common topic with customers is how can you make it easier for us to operate in those environments with very strict compliance criteria. So if you need FIPS today in your environments, like you probably know already what it is, right? For those who don't, like I don't want this to derail into a talk about FIPS, which is a fairly complex space. But basically, the short version is that like FIPS is a set of policies and a set of standards that regulates workloads for the US government, as well as the Canadian government and some highly regulated industries. In regard to Amazon Linux, the most relevant of those is FIPS 140. FIPS 140 specifies which cryptographic algorithms, right, can be used and how they can be used in environments that are covered by FIPS validation and FIPS certification. So customers that required FIPS with Amazon Linux were previously limited to either running Amazon Linux 2 or were limited to using Amazon Linux 2023 under special approval, while the AL23 cryptographic modules were still under test by the FIPS standards. Earlier this year, Amazon Linux 2023 got the final FIPS validation for all of our cryptographic modules. And so we got final validation for like OpenSSL, the kernel, NSS, GNU TLS, and libgcrypt. And what this changes for you is that if you need to run Amazon Linux in an environment where FIPS is required, you can now do so confidently, right, by launching any of the default Amazon Linux armies. And you have the choice to either enforce FIPS as you launch instances by changing your kernel command line and enforcing FIPS mode, or you can do so by turning it on the user space configuration of your various applications. Of course, this comes with some caveats. And I specifically avoid mentioning like versions of OpenSSL and kernel in my previous couple of sentences. But the version that were FIPS validated are the version that we released Amazon Linux with a few years ago. Newer version of the kernel, like the 6.12 kernel, are not yet FIPS validated. They are still undergoing testing. But this process is ongoing. And similarly, OpenSSL 3.2 that we released earlier this week is also undergoing revalidation. Moving forward, as we have committed previously, we are going to keep rerunning revalidation of Amazon Linux 2023 as we make updates and as we make like feature updates, but also security updates to make sure that if you have like strict requirements to run the specific versions that were FIPS validated, that you can do so, that you can catch up to the current state of Amazon Linux over months and years. The other compliance kind of topic that has often come up with customers is the DISA STIGs. Right? So DISA STIGs are a set of required configuration that needs to be applied to your instances and your workload, mostly in the kind of defense-related industry, but are also adopted by other groups, other industries that have strict compliance requirements. So AWS partnered with DISA to develop the Amazon Linux 2023 DISA STIG. This is very fresh. It was released, I think, back in September, so only a few weeks ago. So now, from now on, if you operate in environments that have requirements for DISA STIGs configuration, you can follow this document and apply all of those configurations to Amazon Linux 2023 instances to make sure that they conform to the specifications. Of course, like nobody likes to manually configure instances, or you will have to apply all of those updates to your configuration management software. So that's a bit of an hassle. So to avoid this, we partnered with two key AWS services to automate the DISA STIG configuration on your behalf. So if you are using EC2 Image Builder, you can now toggle the DISA STIG configuration, DISA STIG documents for Amazon Linux 2023 as part of your image build. And so if you do so, it will ensure that every image that you build with the EC2 Image Builder are going to come right out of the box, pre-configured for the Amazon Linux 2023 DISA STIG, and that will ensure that the resulting instances are also going to be properly configured. Similarly, if you use Amazon Linux AWS System Manager to configure your running instances, the AWS System Manager have released a managed document for Amazon Linux 2023 DISA STIG that you can also apply on your running instances or on your new instances as they launch to make sure that you get conformance to the DSASTIG for Amazon Linux 2023 out of the box without manual work on your part. Hopefully this is useful to some of you. Another interesting development that we did in the last year is work on OpenSSL performance improvements. And so when we released Amazon Linux 2023 back in March of 2023, we released it with OpenSSL 3.0. And some of the feedback we got like fairly early on by customers is that some of you noticed like performance differences between Amazon Linux 2 and Amazon Linux 2023. And some of you pointed to very specific performance degradation as you transition from using Amazon Linux 2 with OpenSSL 1.0.2 to using Amazon Linux 2023 with OpenSSL 3.0. It turns out that those performance differences were pretty standards across the industry. They were seen on all of the Linux distributions that were early adopters of OpenSSL 3.0. There were good reasons to adopt OpenSSL 3.0 at the time. OpenSSL 3.0 comes with a ton of new functionalities that make it easier to operate services. It does much better at backward compatibility, and it provides much cleaner API and much better separation between the APIs and the data structures, so it makes life much easier for application developers. But it was a major rewrite of OpenSSL, and so it came with a lot of growing pain that we only realized like after it started to be more widely adopted. So the upstream community has worked through those issues. There's been a lot of work in recent versions of OpenSSL to try to cover the gap there. And so earlier this year with Amazon Linux 2023.7, one of our quarterly release version, we have released OpenSSL 3.2. And the data that we've gotten from our internal benchmarks as well as customers show that OpenSSL 3.2 and Amazon Linux 2023 covers most of the performance gaps, if not all of the performance gaps that were present with OpenSSL 3.0. And we are back to the performance level that you would have seen on the AL2 instance with OpenSSL 1.0.2. So in fact, like synthetic benchmarks that we run shows improvements up to 15 times faster with OpenSSL 3.2 than we have seen with OpenSSL 3.0. And of course, like we all know that synthetic benchmarks only mean so much. So data from customers as well as from our internal teams running TLS workloads have shown like up to real world 2 to 3 times performance improvement in the establishment of TLS sessions. That's fairly significant, right? And for some of you, it can result in like not only performance improvement, but cost saving, as we've been told by customers that they had to like upgrade instance types that they were using in order to keep up with the volume of requests that they had to process on each of their instances or to scale up their fleet. And so we think that this is going to solve this problem for you. And another separate thing that we did at the same time as we upgraded OpenSSL versions is that we separated the FIPS provider, the FIPS modules of OpenSSL out in its own package, right? Meaning that if you have strict requirement to run the FIPS provider that were validated through the FIPS validation of AL 2023, you can do so by installing this specific package independently from the OpenSSL version that we ship on the base ARMY. And so even though our ARMY ship the latest OpenSSL version, you can keep installing the FIPS module that were originally validated by installing the separate FIPS provider. And we are going to keep doing so as we keep evolving OpenSSL. And as we revalidate Amazon Linux 2023 for FIPS, we are going to upgrade the version of the FIPS provider as well to catch up to the OpenSSL version that we ship in our base ARMYs. Graphical desktop is another thing that we did this year. And so it turns out that some customers came to us and customers don't all run their workloads on EC2, or customers don't all run their workload in kind of server types of environments. And so we learned from you that like there are requirements out there for like graphical desktop requirements for maybe you are testing graphical application at scale, or maybe you have specific application that your system operators have to run in a graphical environment. That's an interesting development because I remember sitting in meetings as we as we were designing what will become Amazon Linux 2023 several years ago, and where we took the decision that we're not going to do a graphical desktop. Right? We didn't think this was required. We built a distro for the cloud. We built a distro for EC2. So we thought we're going to keep the operating system kind of simpler, and we are going to kind of constrain the dependencies that have to be brought in. And so we didn't do a graphical desktop. And we learned from customers that you know better, right? You know your requirements better than we know them ourselves. And so we went back to the drawing board and adapted Amazon Linux to include a new graphical desktop. So there's nothing special about it, which is the good news, right? It's based on GNOME. It does everything you will expect from a graphical desktop. You can use a mouse, move the pointer around, and you can browse the internet in all of its colorful glory. The specific work that we did is we worked really hard to try to keep the dependency tree of this graphical desktop as small as possible. We worked to try to keep some repeat offender applications that drag in critical and important CVs on a regular basis out of the dependency tree, so that we don't bring those on your instances. And we partnered with the Amazon DCV team to make sure that you had a secure mechanism to use for remote access to your systems running the graphical desktop. Looking at the download data that we have, looking at our download logs from the graphical desktop package, it turns out that some of the packages that we had to bring in for the graphical desktop seem to be more popular than the graphical desktop itself. And so if you have been using the video codecs that we release as part of the graphical desktop update, I will very much like to learn from you what you are doing with them and better understand your usage and your requirements so that we can better support those in the future. But it turns out that more people seem to be downloading our video codecs than they are downloading the actual desktop itself, which makes me very curious about what you are all doing, and I would like to learn more. So customers have also told us over the past several years that running Amazon Linux on our EC2 accelerated instance types is sometimes harder than it should. It's been difficult to select, to understand. So as I launch this instance type, which are the best NVIDIA software stack that I should be running on my EC2 accelerated instance. There's been a kind of a disconnect between our documentation and the documentation of the vendor NVIDIA here on the hardware, and we've wanted to make it easier for you to make sure that you run the right software on your instance to get the best performances. So in the last year, we have released the Amazon Linux 2023 NVIDIA repositories. So this is not original package that we built ourselves. We are taking the RPMs that NVIDIA already make available on the website, and you may be asking yourself, so why will I be using those instead of getting them directly from NVIDIA? So the difference with our repositories is that we have partnered with the EC2 platform teams that build the accelerated platforms that you might be using, and we work with them to qualify every update that NVIDIA puts out. And so every new RPM of the drivers and the CUDA software stack that NVIDIA releases, right, we put through our automated pipeline, and we validate them for regression, and we make sure that they meet the right level of performance that we expect out of those instances. And only then are those packages moved to the Amazon Linux 2023 NVIDIA repositories. And so we did this to make sure that you add a mechanism to which you could ensure that you are running a version of the software that has been properly tested on the EC2 platforms and that produce the best performance that we can get out of those instances. We've also added security metadata to those repositories because as your AI workloads transition from fast experimentation to production systems, and as compliance and auditors catch up to what we have all been doing there, we want to make sure that you have mechanisms in place to report and verify that you are running the latest versions and that you have applied all of the security patches on your systems. So every time that NVIDIA releases new versions that cover CVEs and fix pending security issues that they have discovered in their software, we also produce security advisories for our NVIDIA repositories so that your automation and your scanners can pick them up and make sure that you report the correct states for your systems. And of course, those repositories are replicated across all AWS regions and all AZs so that you don't have to reach out to the public internet or do cross-region access in order to get your packages, and that you get low latency access to our repositories wherever your instances are running. So if you want to look a little bit more into this, you can easily enable those repositories on your instances with this simple DNF command to install the NVIDIA release package that will apply the configuration for the repositories, and from that point on, you can follow NVIDIA documentation to install all the packages that your workloads may need. And so last but not least, right, a few weeks ago, we released the supplementary packages for Amazon Linux. That's a bit of a mouthful, so we came up with this cool SPAL acronym to refer to them. We did this in response to customers telling us that as you migrated from AL2 to AL 2023, a lot of you were previously relying on packages coming out of the EPEL repositories, the Fedora EPEL repositories. And as we released AL 2023, that the fact that you could not find those packages in Amazon Linux core repositories was making it harder for you to migrate your instances from AL2 to AL 2023. And so if this is the case, right, so we released, a few weeks ago, we released the SPAL repositories. We did this in collaboration with SUSE. So we partnered with SUSE to rebuild packages from the EPEL 9 repositories and rebuild them for Amazon Linux 2023. They came out with a few thousand packages. We are going to keep increasing this. This is a kind of a living project, and we are going to keep building in new packages in those repositories over the next couple of weeks and months. We hope that this is going to make it easier for customers who are still on AL2, and we have been kind of blocked on some package availability to transition to AL 2023. Of course, this repository comes with a couple of caveats that I need to warn you about, right? We do not support those packages to the same level that we support packages in the core repositories. So we are going to make our commitment to the SPAL repositories that any update to those packages that is made in the kind of the upstream Fedora project are going to be brought back into the Amazon Linux SPAL repositories. But we're not planning at this time to make kind of original updates that are independently from the Fedora project in those repositories. And we are currently not publishing security advisories for the SPAL project either. So this is a bit of like use at your own risk model, but we're committed to making this work with Amazon Linux 2023 moving forward. I can start enumerating a long list of packages, but I encourage you to kind of hit our documentation to see all of the packages that have currently been published. And as new packages are added, this is going to be updated. So we had a lot of things happening this year, right? I think the key things I really want you to remember are changes to the kernel lifecycle, right? This is super important, and this is true for Amazon Linux 2023, but this is going to be true moving forward. And so we're really trying to adapt with what's happening in the upstream community here and making sure that we deliver you kind of sustainable kernel updates. Changes to compliance, like if you care about this, you already know. So like pay attention. OpenSSL improvements have been a huge update this year. We are going to keep updating versions as time goes on to get you the best performances out of Amazon Linux 2023 on EC2. And of course, like we released a ton of new packages through SPAL. I think that's happened like 2 weeks ago. So this is all very exciting and still like living project. So on that, I'm going to hand the mic back to Sri, who's going to talk to you about what's happening with AL2.
Thank you, Fred. And before we move and talk about what's happening with Amazon Linux, this next version, let's talk about AL2. Hey, are your workloads still on Amazon Linux 2? Because a quick reminder that AL2 or Amazon Linux 2 is upcoming its end of support on June 30, 2026. So approximately 6 months from now, AL2 will reach its end of support. We encourage all our customers to get off of AL2 before the end of support, upgrade to the latest version of Amazon Linux, which is AL 2023. Let us talk a little bit about what happens after June 30th, 2026. So on July 1st, what will happen? While you'll still have access to the AL2 repositories, and if you are still using AL2 instances or AL2 armies, you will be able to use that. You can continue to use that. However, AWS will not provide security patches, bug fixes, or AWS support in a regular fashion. That's why we encourage all our customers, if you have not already planned your migrations, please plan your migrations, test them, and move off of AL2 before the end of support date. Okay, let us switch gears and talk about the future. What's coming up next with Amazon Linux? So in this session, you heard about the AL2 end of support timelines. We just talked about it now, and Frederick talked about the AL 2023 new features. What I'm excited to share with you all is that we have started working on the next version of Amazon Linux. And as you can see on the screen, it is going to be coming up in 2027. So before I give a little bit more details about what the next version of Amazon Linux looks like, let me give you a little bit of context. So as our customers were migrating from AL2 to AL 2023, we heard a lot of feedback from our customers. And we've categorized them into 4 different buckets. First one is continuity and predictability. What you and our customers mentioned is that you appreciate AWS integrations with various other AWS services. You appreciate that we are able to provide a secure and a stable OS, which is obviously the fundamental components to any OS. So you would like us to continue doing that. And also provide predictability. Give you certain time about when will an end of support come up or when will the new version of the OS come up. This will help you plan your migrations, your upgrades. So this is what we heard from our customers. Second is, as customers were migrating from one major version to another, in this case AL2 to AL 2023, many of you mentioned that, can you make these OS upgrades easier? So this was something that a lot of our customers mentioned. Third one is customers in regulatory industries like healthcare, finance, and government agencies wanted us to provide FIPS availability as soon as possible so that they can migrate over to the new version of the OS as soon as possible. Last but not the least, we heard from our customers that you want to work with us. You want to provide feedback. You want to be able to see a preview of what's coming up with the next version. So what this feedback translated to is forming the pillars for the next version of Amazon Linux. So firstly, the next version of Amazon Linux will be evolving from AL 2023. It will be built on the success of it, and we will continue to maintain all the seamless integrations that we have with AWS services today. Second is security. You heard a lot about security in terms of CV fixes and the kernel changes, et cetera, from Frederick earlier. So we'll continue to provide those secure updates. But in addition to that, we are thinking of providing the automated kernel version updates by default. So you heard about the rolling kernel versions, so that is what we will provide in the next version of Amazon Linux. The third one is easy upgrades. So one is by providing early access or the preview access, you are able to understand what is coming up in the next version of Amazon Linux. It'll also help you plan your upgrades better. Second, we will enhance our documentation, our best practices to help migrations much easier. And lastly, we are also thinking about overlapping kernel versions. So for example, say AL 2023 will have a kernel version as 6.18, We'll make sure that the same kernel version is also available in the next version of Amazon Linux so that when you migrate, it becomes much easier. Last but not the least is we know our customers are investing heavily in AI workloads. Now, the role of an OS in this is to be able to support these workloads, AI ML workloads. And we can do so by providing the right drivers, for example. And so the next version of Amazon Linux will support, will support and provide foundations for these AI and ML workloads. So we understand from you and our customers about the predictability and all the other feedback that you've provided. So when we are ready to announce the next version of Amazon Linux, we will provide a 12-month advance notice. So watch out for our announcement on the Amazon Linux product pages. And in addition to that, we are looking for feedback from you. We want to hear from you and understand what really matters. So the QR code on the bottom right here actually takes you to the GitHub. So when you go there, create an issue of feature request and provide your feedback there. We will definitely take that into consideration. So with that, I would like to wrap up the session with 3 key takeaways. First is that AL2 or Amazon Linux 2 end of support is upcoming on June 30, 2026. So we request our customers, if you have not already planned your migrations, please plan it and move off of AL2 before the end of support date. We are continuing to innovate on Amazon Linux. You heard a lot of new features on AL 2023. And as you're migrating from AL2 to AL 2023, and if you have dependencies on Apple packages, make sure to check out SPAL. It's a new feature that we just launched, and it can help you migrate easily. You don't have to build these packages from source. Familiarize yourself with the kernel changes that's happening. And if you are a regulatory customer and you need FIPS or DSSTIG, please make sure to check that out too. Lastly, Amazon Linux Next is upcoming. So please watch out for the product pages for any future announcements, as well as provide feedback on GitHub, and we'd love to hear from you. So with that, I thank you all for attending this session, and please remember to fill out the session survey in the mobile app, and thank you again. If you have any questions, just come talk to us. Thank you so much.